Hey guys, my name's Matt Bourne. I'm from Griffith University on the Gold Coast, and today I'm joined by Associate Professor Claire Minahan, also from Griffith University. Claire is an accredited sports scientist and heads up our Griffith Sports Physiology and Performance Research Centre. Claire's been working in the female athlete space for a number of years and has published extensively in this space. So we're lucky to be joined by Claire today to speak about microcycles and the menstrual cycle and whether or not we need to align these two. So welcome to the show, Claire. If you don't mind, perhaps just giving us a very brief introduction about who you are and the work that you've been up to.
G'day, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. There's not too much more I've got to say. I have been in the area or researching in the area of female athletes and performance for quite some time now. And I began, like most of us do, by comparing male and female athletes and coming up with the same conclusion that women aren't as strong and they're not as fit and not as fast, and I quickly got bored of that, and so changed my attention to what was unique about female athletes and how we could optimise female performance specifically. Spent probably the last sort of 5 to 10 years really concentrating on unique female physiology and how that affects health, well-being and performance. And I think the one thing that's most obvious to everyone is the female sex steroid hormones, that is estrogen and progesterone, and how they fluctuate, and how then the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraception affects health, well-being and performance in female athletes. So I've been, applying some of my research to elite female athletes, both professional and Olympic sports, and getting some good results. We've got an incredibly long way to go. Just published a paper on just basic knowledge of female athletes surrounding the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraception, and got really alarming results, finding that even our most elite female athletes don't have the best knowledge about what is a normal menstrual cycle, let alone how that might affect their health, well-being and performance. And so we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to start educating women, girls and female athletes on what is a normal menstrual cycle. And from there we can provide them with ongoing knowledge about how that might affect their health, well-being and performance.
Okay, excellent. So as you say, female physiology and its impact on performance and of course injury risk is obviously a very topical area at the moment. Perhaps you could start off by just giving us a very brief overview of what a normal menstrual cycle is.
Yeah, I think that is a good place to start. Half the population should know what a normal menstrual cycle is, and I guess because there's so much variation in what that looks like, it's very difficult to define. But based on the law of averages, a girl should get their first period or start menstruating between the ages of 11 and 14 years. And then the cycle of fluctuating female sex steroid hormones and then the bleeding that occurs about every month should happen between 25 and 35 days. So that's a cycle length, a normal cycle length. The actual bleeding or period should go for about 4 to 7 days, and there should be a menstrual flow of about 30 to 60 mils. Now, you can tell already by those statistics that there is some variation in what we think is a normal menstrual cycle, but there's probably at least 25% of girls and women that have variation outside those normal ranges. Very difficult to define and therefore quite difficult for young girls, female athletes, women to understand what is normal rather than what is common or what they believe to be normal.
Excellent. Thanks for a very succinct overview. So we often hear menstrual cycle dysfunction being thrown around in the media in particular. So what is menstrual cycle dysfunction and how common is it?
Yeah, so it's reasonably self-explanatory in that it is not functioning correctly or properly, but that can, present in a number of conditions, and that results in abnormal symptoms. So one of the conditions probably more well known to people is the condition of amenorrhea. There's primary amenorrhea, which is not having a period by the age of 15. And then secondary amenorrhea, an individual, an athlete, a girl, a female who has had their period but then has an absence of their menstrual period for at least 3 months. And that would be the definition of amenorrhea, and quite common in athletes, more common than we think. Oligomenorrhea is another condition, and that's where periods don't occur on a regular basis. You might have them occurring regularly and then they disappear for a while and then come back again. The cycle may be shortened, it may be lengthened, but it's certainly not regular. Premenstrual syndrome, or PMS, that can have symptoms such as fluid retention, headaches, irritability, fatigue, cramping, that kind of thing. And if these cramps and these periods become unusually painful, then that condition is called dysmenorrhea. There's some other conditions in terms of menstrual cycle dysfunction, but I think I've mentioned the main ones. Probably the other one is a very heavy menstrual flow, and that's another condition.
Okay, excellent. So a very common question that we get from applied practitioners such as strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists, physiotherapists, who are often working at the coalface of sport, is whether strength and other physical qualities actually change across the menstrual cycle. So I wonder if you could briefly touch on that, and then as an extension of that question, outline whether we should be lining our strength training and periodizing our programs with menstrual cycle phases.
Yeah, they're the $64 million question. And I think if I had a really clear answer to that, I'd be doing some really great things with female athletes in strength and conditioning. It is becoming clearer, but we've got an exceptionally long way to go. And I think one of the issues is that we have so much variation in the menstrual cycle. We have very few scientific studies that provide high quality evidence either way in terms of proving or disproving whether the menstrual cycle affects acute strength or adaptation to strength training. So I guess there's a few things to think about. One is, does strength, does speed or anaerobic capacity and endurance change across the menstrual cycle? And if we think about the menstrual cycle in 3 phases, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, the follicular phase being from the start of the period through about 12 to 13 days. And that's where we see right at the start quite low levels of estrogen and progesterone, and then moving through the follicular phase and a gradual increase in estrogen. And when estrogen peaks at about 13 to 14 days, we call that the ovulation phase, and progesterone is quite low at that point. And then we move into the luteal phase, which is the back end of the month or the cycle, from about 15 days through to 28 days. And that's where progesterone and estrogen are both elevated. Estrogen comes down from its peak, but it still remains elevated. And progesterone is certainly elevated during that luteal phase. So you can imagine these fluctuations in both estrogen and progesterone to create these 3 distinct phases. Follicular phase being low progesterone and estrogen, the ovulation phase being high estrogen, low progesterone, and the luteal phase, both elevated estrogen and progesterone. Now, in terms of whether force or strength changes across the menstrual cycle. As I mentioned, there is no clear evidence. There is no clear evidence to suggest that strength changes across the menstrual cycle. We know that estrogen is androgenic, similar to testosterone. And so there's some emerging evidence to suggest that at the back end of the follicular phase towards the ovulation phase, where we're getting this increase in estrogen and progesterone remaining low, that we may have increased strength. But I do believe that we need more high quality evidence to come to a complete conclusion there. And in terms of endurance and anaerobic capacity, we don't tend to see any convincing evidence that these things change across the menstrual cycle. I think perhaps what's more powerful is what hormonal contraception does to endogenous estrogen and progesterone, and that is to completely suppress the secretion of estrogen and progesterone. So we get a flattened, naturally occurring estrogen and progesterone and very high levels of synthetic estrogen and progesterone. Now, it's not just whether strength is increased or decreased across or in difference to hormonal contraception and normally or naturally cycling, but what is the response to strength type exercise as well. And we've done some really nice studies in delayed onset muscle soreness and muscle damage after exercise, and found that women who are on hormonal contraception tend to have more muscle damage after eccentric exercise. On one hand, we know that could be a stimulus for muscle growth, but on the other hand, we realise that you may require more recovery to then lift the same or train the same. So again, the results are pretty unclear in terms of acute responses to exercise across the menstrual phase and both on and off hormonal contraception. There's some really good work by Lebrun, admittedly sort of in the earlier stages of this type of research, that shows women on oral contraception have a 10% decrease in peak oxygen uptake. That study hasn't been repeated, but no one study has showed an increase in endurance in women on hormonal contraception. So I think some really good research to be repeated there. To your second point, should we align strength training with menstrual phase? The old microcycles and menstrual cycles. A menstrual cycle going for about 1 month and a typical microcycle lasting for about 1 month. They sort of match up quite well. And the question is, should we increase intensity or volume at certain stages of the menstrual cycle for optimal adaptation? And this has probably been the most convincing research of late regarding menstrual cycle and menstrual phase. 3 particular studies, Rees, Sung and Wallstrom, have all concluded that follicular phase-based training results in greater strength and cross-sectional area adaptation. So that means that front-ending your microcycle with strength sessions, so that is putting more strength sessions in the follicular phase compared to the luteal phase, results in optimal or more optimal strength gains and gains in cross-sectional area. So some really interesting results there, and they're quite short studies. So 12 weeks, I think, was the longest study. Looking forward to seeing some evidence in elite athletes and also longer training studies.
Thanks, Claire. That's really interesting. So you've touched on some evidence there to suggest that that strength may in fact change across the menstrual cycle, and we know that strength and other factors that you touched on, like an accumulation of exercise-induced muscle damage, might in fact be risk factors for injuries, particularly soft tissue injuries. I wonder if there's any link between injury risk and menstrual cycle phase or hormonal contraception.
Yeah, there's there's a lot of media attention around injury risk, menstrual cycle, and hormonal contraception, and I think it's premature to be making any conclusions, particularly about menstrual phase and injury risk. I certainly think it warrants further investigation, but it has to be high quality evidence. And at this point, we don't have any high quality evidence to suggest that there is an increased injury risk at any point of the menstrual phase. Mechanistically, it's possible that increased circulating concentrations of endogenous estrogen may increase ligament laxity, and we know that endogenous estrogen may increase force or strength. So if you couple those together at the ovulation phase, you have an increase in muscular strength and an increase in ligament laxity. Potentially it's the perfect storm, but again, no high quality evidence and long-term evidence to suggest any phase of the menstrual cycle results in an increased injury risk. But certainly, I think because of the mechanistic links, it requires further investigation. Regarding oral contraceptives on soft tissue injury risk, there's been a really nice review of the literature by the Department of Orthopaedic Surgery at Stanford, a paper by Canopta. Jacqueline has looked at 29 studies examining the effect of oral contraception on soft tissue injury risk. She found that of those studied, only 1 or 2 received high quality of evidence score, and that's really important that we make sure that we examine studies that are of a high quality, that can provide us with evidence that is repeatable, that is valid. Having said that, the conclusion is that oral contraceptives may in fact serve as a therapeutic role in decreasing ACL injury risk. And the basis of that, again, is around ACL tissue and ligament laxity. So there is potential for oral contraceptives to decrease ACL risk injury, but that's based on one study. So again, a lot more work to be done there. And I think before we all jump on oral contraceptives to reduce our injury risk, we have to weigh up all the health, all the well-being, and all the performance consequences of doing something like that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point there, that being that there's a lack of high quality research in this area. So I wonder if you could give our listeners just some, or perhaps some suggestions for future research in this area.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. The makeup, the potency of oral contraceptions is changing all of the time. There's an incredible amount of variability in the menstrual cycle itself. So, one piece of advice, at least to coaches and athletes, is to start monitoring their own menstrual cycle, start recording wellness and health attributes around the menstrual cycle phase. In terms of research, I'm only aware of a handful of studies that have done longitudinal study designs. So we we often find cross-sectional comparisons between women or athletes either on and or off hormonal contraception or at different phases of the menstrual cycle. I think if we need, to gather more high-quality evidence, we've got to see more longitudinal studies, and we've got to see those longitudinal studies being performed on female athletes. I guess there are some ethical and practical hurdles to cross in terms of having athletes come on and off hormonal contraception or be tested, several times across the menstrual cycle. But if we want that evidence, we have to be patient. And there is a real risk that, topics that do come into favour are flooded with evidence that probably isn't of high quality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wonder if we could, just in wrapping up, if you might be able to provide some practical recommendations for coaches or applied practitioners in terms of helping their female athletes optimise performance and minimise injury risk.
Yeah, I think the first one is acknowledging that the menstrual cycle is unique to women and that it can potentially affect health, well-being and performance. So an acknowledgement that it is important. Secondly, to provide athletes with avenues to educate themselves. And I know that the AIS is working on an education site where there's some basic information for athletes to be directed to. I think there should be an open conversation between coaches and athletes. And if coaches don't feel comfortable with those conversations, at least being able to direct their athletes to their general practitioners, to dietitians, to other professionals that might be able to have those conversations with their athletes. But certainly encouraging where an athlete keeps a training diary, perhaps to also keep a diary of their menstrual cycle and how their performances, their well-being, their health fluctuates alongside symptoms of their menstrual cycle and in fact what day they are in their menstrual cycle. I often ask the question to elite female athletes, I bet you know what day the Olympic final's on. Do you know what day of your menstrual cycle that is? And if the answer's no, then I would suggest they're not paying enough attention to their menstrual cycle. What we don't want to do is make this an issue. What we are trying to do is make it a non-issue so that we deal with all the dysfunction, we take care of health in the first instance, we take care of female athletes' well-being, and at the point where we're satisfied that menstrual cycle is normal, it's reflecting good health, then we can start talking about how we can optimise performance.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Some really nice suggestions there. So thanks again for your time. I think it's a really excellent overview of this area and some of the research which is emerging in it. Just in finishing up, of course, some of our listeners are likely to have questions and they're going to want to follow some of that work. How can they get in touch with you and where can they find your work?
Absolutely. They can send me a tweet at Claire Minahan. They can have a look on the Griffith website and all my contact details are there and I'd be more than happy to take questions.
Great. Thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks for the time with you, Matt.